Welcome to StickMan Explains.
In May 2025, it will have been 80 years since the end of World War II in Europe, and in the fall, it will be 80 years since the end of World War II globally. One would think that after such a long time, with declassified documents, no mysteries about the conflict should remain. But they do exist, and not just local ones like the betrayal of and Frank's family, but truly global ones. Even the simple question of when World War II began is still debated, with several different viewpoints. As you've probably guessed, in the next couple of minutes, we'll delve into all the major mysteries of the largest conflict in history, starting, perhaps, with the most significant one. Was the USSR truly preparing to attack Germany? Admit it, you've heard one version of this story or another. Some say that the entire Soviet army was offensive, leading to the terrible events of 1941. Others add that the tanks were even fueled for a march to Berlin. Some even claim that Hitler supposedly preempted Stalin by only 2 weeks. And furthermore, the Barbarossa Plan itself only emerged as a defensive measure after Germany learned of the USSR's impending attack. The irony is that this supposedly historical mystery isn't actually a mystery at all. This is a case where so-called folk history, a purely hypothetical and imaginary narrative, has seeped into the scientific understanding of history, making some believe there's a secret here. However, for historians worldwide, there is no mystery. The German historian with the ironic name Hans Adolf Jacobsen, who literally fought on Germany's side in World War II, published a comprehensive work in the 1960s, which was later supplemented and reissued multiple times. This refers to the book 1939 to 1945, World War II, where Jacobsen analyzes declassified and published German documents. One of his conclusions is that when German troops attacked the USSR in the summer of 1941, they found not a single document on Soviet territory that even remotely hinted at an impending attack. The British historian Liddell Hart, in a similar work, writes that German generals laughed at the combat readiness of the Soviet army and saw firsthand how far the Soviets were from aggressive intentions. And even if we attribute all this to the historian's biases, the less obvious situation doesn't stop there. Because in 1941, the USSR as such lacked a class of bomber aircraft. Although there were plenty of planes, bombers among them were few. The P-8 was built in fewer than 100 units. The IL-4 only went into production in 1942, and the role of a bomber was most often performed on paper by the P-2 fighter. The backbone of the Air Force consisted of fighter attack aircraft, and this, according to all textbooks, looks more like a defensive army than an offensive one. And the drills conducted were consistent with this. In 1940, the General Staff of the Red Army conducted 2 war games, where Zhukov played for the Germans and Pavlov for the Red Army. In both, the Germans advanced on the USSR, and Zhukov decisively defeated Pavlov. So, regarding attacks with a 95% probability, it can be asserted that the USSR did not plan to attack anyone. Neither the equipment, nor the documents, nor the exercises conducted by the Red Army indicate this. By the way, Germany's attack in 1941 almost identically repeated the strategy and tactics used by Zhukov in these very exercises. And why the USSR was ultimately unprepared for the attack, that is the real mystery. Many articles and even books have been written about this, but globally, the problem is that in 1945, it was inconvenient for the USSR to launch major investigations and tarnish its image as the victorious army. After Stalin's death, on the contrary, the debunking of the cult of personality exaggerated the problems of 1941, and a second extreme emerged, where everything was very bad and Stalin personally was to blame for everything. In reality, there was a whole series of strategic failures. This ranges from the extremely dubious strategy of repelling an attack with an immediate head-on counterstrike using all available forces and means, to almost zero consideration that the enemy would not attack along an even front but would choose weak points. As a result, the USSR's army, spread thin with a lot of equipment but few soldiers, met Germany's clear and meaningful strikes, concentrated in the necessary directions, which, again, almost exactly copied Zhukov's tactics in earlier Soviet exercises. In short, the mystery here is so complex that it deserves a 1-hour video analysis. If you'd like to see it, let us know in the comments. Now let's head to Dresden. The city is connected to two mysteries. The first mysterious story concerns Germany's gold. Throughout World War II, the Germans systematically removed gold from captured regions, with reserves estimated at $500 billion, which is 3 to 4 times higher in modern prices. Most of the gold was found by the Allied countries and divided among themselves. However, in the chaos of the war's end, entire trains disappeared without a trace. The fate of some of them remains unknown to this day. For example, in May 1945, American General Mark Clark found one of the gold trains in Austria and refused to hand it over, citing that the gold's origin could not be proven. The further fate of an entire gold train remains unknown. But it seems that Clark's return to the U.S. looked something like this. And in Dresden, there are rumors of a couple or 3 gold hoards that treasure hunters are still searching for. But the city is not famous for this. There, on the evening of February 13, 1945, residents heard the familiar air raid siren. But this time with a note that a particularly serious raid was expected. And so it happened. In 2 days, the British and U.S. Air Forces destroyed 50% of all city buildings. And no one still knows how many of its residents. The most recent estimate by a commission from March 2010 is 25,000 people. But in reality, it's impossible to count how many lives were lost in the raid of almost 1,000 bombers that dropped bombs literally everywhere. Many died trying to escape the burning city and succumbed to their injuries in neighboring towns and villages, thus not being included in the statistics. In some parts of Germany, the bombing of Dresden is nicknamed Bombing Holocaust. And here opinions diverge. The Allied version is that Dresden was the 7th largest and 3rd most important transport hub in Germany. About 50,000 people worked in Dresden's 110 military enterprises, making it a legitimate military target. They also remind us that Dresden is by no means the largest episode of civilian casualties in the bombing of Germany. On February 23rd, the city of Pforzheim lost 98% of its urban infrastructure, and 1 in 5 residents died in 22 minutes, which in absolute figures amounted to 18,000 people. The Allies bombed Cologne 262 times, and we won't even mention Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Statistically, Dresden is not an anomaly. The destruction and losses there are slightly higher than average but do not particularly stand out. But there is another opinion. It was the end of hostilities, and Germany had already been divided at the Yalta Conference a couple of days before the bombing. And Dresden was located next to the future meeting place of Soviet and Allied troops, with a 99% probability of falling into the Soviet zone of control after the war. In parallel, as is known from declassified documents, Operation Unthinkable, a war by the Allies against the USSR, was already being developed, within which cities were precisely bombed to the ground. And eyewitness accounts and some pilots say that residential areas were often bombed simply for training novice pilots. Many theorize that Dresden was a demonstration of force to the USSR, and also an economic burden of rebuilding the city after the conflict, which would also fall on the shoulders of the USSR. However, there are also counterarguments. The very symbolism of the Dresden bombings was born from frankly fake information that German revanchists spread after World War II, claiming almost 500,000 victims. And the philosophical question of the necessity of a total bombing of a city in a country that had clearly lost also raises questions. The Germans themselves were not particularly shy in Stalingrad, and should the Allies have behaved differently with their cities? In short, we await your opinion on Dresden in the comments and move on to another mystery. Who started the war and when? As for who, there are, of course, no questions, it was Germany. But historians can't agree on when and what part. It's clear only that the official date of September 1st, 1939, is problematic and only sticks because everyone is used to it. After all, what happened on September 1st, 1939? The annexation of a part of Poland occurred. Exactly the same as on October 1st, 1938, when Germany, following the Munich Agreement, annexed a part of Czechoslovakia. By the way, on the same day, Poland itself annexed another part of Czechoslovakia. And a little earlier, in March 1938, Germany also annexed Austria. September 1st is taken as the start date of World War II because of the active phase that began with the invasion of Poland. But there's a snag here because there wasn't really an active phase. From September 1st, 1939, the so-called phony war or Sitzkrieg began, where, over 5 months in a state of war with Britain and France, Germany lost 11 aircraft and about 100 soldiers. It's difficult to call this a hot phase. And if we consider the capture of Denmark and Norway as hot, then again, the beginning of World War II could also be considered the capture of Austria in 1938. It truly became hot on the European front on May 10, 1940, when at 5:35 a.m., German troops, according to Plan Yellow, began large-scale offensive operations against France. Only then did World War II in Europe transition from a local to a global phase. But wait, what if you lived in China? Then the dates for you would move even further back to July 7, 1937. It was on this day that Japanese and Chinese troops clashed in the first large-scale battle, which would start a war whose end on September 2, 1945, ironically, is also considered the end of World War II. But why is the end recorded as World War II, but the beginning in 1937 is not? Because China's role in World War II was underestimated for decades and considered something local and insignificant. Although, in fact, already in 1937, the Sino-Japanese conflict was quite international. The USSR supplied China with weapons, money, and, for example, built the Sarya-Zakharumchilinzhou Highway from 1937, through which something more akin to Lend-Lease flowed from the USSR to China. Soviet specialists also built the first aircraft assembly plant in China, and Japan also bought from the United States until Pearl Harbor. Then, of course, everything turned upside down 10 times, but the fact remains. On September 1st, 1939, a conflict began in Europe, but it was relatively local and serious hostilities started on May 10, 1939. Annexations, Anschluss, and winter wars occurred in Europe both before and after September 1st, 1939. So many historians believe that if everything is to be counted, it should start at least from 1938, and even then only in Europe because globally the end of World War II is the end of the war between China and Japan, and its beginning is July 7, 1937, and it would be logical to move the beginning of the conflict to this date. What do you think? When did World War II really begin? Should Dresden have been bombed? And was the USSR preparing for offensive actions? Leave your opinion in the comments, and that's all for us for now. See you next time, friends.